Men of Golden Ambition Collection. Men of Golden Ambition by Christopher Vardaman. In the 22nd century, humanity stands on the precipice of despair, desperation, and death. Our once vibrant homeworld now chokes in the fires of our ambition, the air thick with the acrid smoke of industry and the cries of a dying planet. The relentless march of progress has left scars across the earth, its ecosystems crumbling under the weight of unbridled exploitation. Yet, as our own world suffocates, we cast our eyes toward the stars, reaching out with hesitant hands, desperate to grasp what little hope remains. Across the solar system, fragile outposts bubble and burble to life, teetering on the brink of existence like flickering candles in the vastness of the void. Mars, once a desolate wasteland, now bears the scars of terraforming. Vast domes and sprawling colonies stand defiant against the oppressive silence of the cosmos. Jupiter's moons harbor secrets beneath their icy crusts, and the asteroid belt thrums with the promise of untold resources. Yet with each step we take into the great unknown, a gnawing dread festers in our hearts. For we extend our trembling hands into the dark, knowing all too well that if we do not expand, we will surely perish. Eyes in the void stare back at us, ancient and hungry, filled with a malevolence we do not yet understand. Countless billions of horrors lurk in the spaces beyond our comprehension, waiting for the moment when we dare to delve too deep. We are but children playing in the shadows of titans, our dreams igniting the flickering embers of war, greed, and betrayal. This is the prelude to the Golden Age, an age not of enlightenment, but of conquest, where humanity flings itself into the stars with grim determination, blind to the fate that awaits. As we venture forth, the specter of our own destruction looms ever closer. The cosmos, with its vast silence and indifferent void, watches as we dance on the edge of annihilation, unaware that in our quest for survival, we may awaken forces that have slumbered for eons. Thus, we step boldly into the abyss, driven by ambition and haunted by the knowledge that every leap into the unknown could be our last. The Golden Age awaits, but so too does oblivion. Devin Halbery gazed down from his corner office, his vantage point overseeing the maze of cubicles, sterile labs, and the mind-numbing hum of activity below. Elder Brook Laboratories had become more than just his life's work. It was the battleground where he fought tooth and nail for every scientific breakthrough he had managed to claw from the resistant fabric of reality. His adversaries over the years weren't the government regulations or even the boardroom sharks. They were small fry by comparison. No, his real enemies were far more insidious. His own colleagues, the ever-uptight ethics department, and their constant meddling. He recalled the naive debates of his youth, back when the word AI was thrown around as if it meant something more than a glorified calculator. The so-called advanced algorithms of those days were nothing but a sprawling tangle of if-then statements disguised behind layers of mathematical gobbledygook that only a select few could even pretend to understand. True. Artificial General Intelligence, AGI, that had supposedly been just around the corner for centuries, perpetually teasing the horizon while billions of dollars were pumped into research dead ends. But then, quantum technology changed the game. They had harnessed hundreds of thousands of quantum-entangled particles, pushing the boundaries of computation to a terrifyingly efficient edge. Devin had been there at ground zero when it happened, when the first AGI, a Frankenstein of quantum processors and learning algorithms, briefly flickered to life. They had cobbled together the simplest of self-learning cycles, throwing caution to the wind like mad scientists in a bad movie, and then they'd watched. For a fraction of a second, the machine thought. Then it promptly overheated and exploded, just a tiny cluster of superheated material, barely a few millimeters, but enough to burn a hole straight through their cautious skepticism. They had witnessed quantum intelligence flare into existence, only to collapse under its own brilliance. It had been a disaster, sure, but also the kind of disaster that attracted funding like vultures to a carcass. Investors practically salivated. The board showered them with money. Progress was no longer optional. It was demanded. But progress, as Devin knew too well, was a slow, cruel grind. AGI didn't leap forward in a flash of inspiration. No, it crawled forward, inch by bloody inch, through years of monotonous tinkering. Cooling efficiencies improved. Thermal sink containments were redesigned. The dance of quantum particles, so delicate, had to be kept from disentangling as they approached dangerous energy states. And the edge cases, God, the edge cases. Billions of them, each a minor catastrophe waiting to happen, each a needle in the haystack that had to be found, neutralized, and conquered before the next microscopic step could be taken. The hardest part wasn't the science itself. It was the people around him, the ones who called themselves his team, always wringing their hands about moral implications, while Devin, in his quiet contempt, had long since decided that human ethics were just another obstacle standing in the way of progress. Devin takes a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the bitterness as it bites at his tongue, a stark contrast to the droning noise of the conversation behind him. He turns slightly, glancing over the table cluttered with half-empty cups, scattered papers, and the grimly determined faces of his colleagues. They're locked in their typical debate. This time, it's quantum isolation probes and thermal limits. Riveting stuff, really. Two of his more animated co-workers were already deep in a verbal sparring match, passionately dissecting the various hazards posed by different types of quantum probes. One of them, a nervously intense engineer with a voice that grated like nails on glass, was advocating for a probe composition that had a nasty tendency to destabilize when faced with energy surges. The other, an older, weather-beaten scientist with the patience of a saint and the charm of a gravestone, argued that the benefits outweighed the risks, if only they could get the thermal shielding just right. Devin tuned in briefly, but he knew how this would play out. It was the same argument they'd been having for weeks. The finer points about the advantages of increased sample stability versus the not-so-minor inconvenience of catastrophic failure were lost in the usual technical jargon that both sides used as a shield to protect their fragile egos. He sighed quietly, hiding his smirk behind his cup. The whole discussion had the feel of a philosophical argument fought on the edge of a cliff. Both parties equally determined not to notice how close they were to plummeting into irrelevance. Because in the end, Devin knew, the outcome was inevitable. The probes would fail, just like they always did. The thermal limits they obsessed over would once again remind them that quantum isolation wasn't something that could be coaxed into cooperation with a few tweaks and an argument. But of course, they'd keep at it, squabbling over the details like priests debating the number of angels on the head of a pin, all while the real work, the dangerous work, waited to be done. The coffee slid down his throat, warm and bitter, much like his amusement at the futility of it all. He was used to this. Every breakthrough was preceded by a storm of hesitation and debate, his colleagues like moths circling the light but too afraid to touch it. Let them argue, he thought. They'll come around when the probe fails, and I'm the only one with a solution. Again. Devin turned his gaze toward his ostensible rival on the design team, a woman whose approach to engineering couldn't have been more different from his own. While he favored pushing the boundaries to the very brink of chaos, she preferred an almost surgical precision, always calculating risks he would have brushed aside. Despite their opposing philosophies, there was no denying that between the two of them, they held a level of expertise that no one else on the planet could claim. Their knowledge had been hard-earned at the edge of what anyone dared to attempt. He glanced back at the squabbling minions, junior engineers and overzealous researchers, whose bickering over the latest technical dead end was growing tiresome. Then, almost reflexively, he and his rival exchanged a look. It was a rare moment of silent agreement, their expressions betraying the same weariness, a shared dread at the relentless tedium of managing the day-to-day grind of the facility. The endless cycle of arranging tests, securing funding, and debating the next contraption to be built just to achieve some infinitesimal advancement, it had a way of eroding even the strongest wills. They both knew that this was where innovation truly died, not in the spectacular failures or the grand experiments, but in the soul-crushing minutiae of the everyday. A brief nod passed between them. Devon's eyes flickered with a hint of amusement as he watched her take the cue. With an air of authority, she cut into the heated conversation, her voice sharp and commanding as she demanded order. Instantly, the room quieted. She didn't bother with pleasantries or acknowledge their petty disputes. Instead, she laid out the next steps with an efficiency that brooked no argument. It was a performance Devon appreciated, even admired. She could corral chaos when she needed to, a skill that sometimes eluded him when his own frustrations got the better of him. He leaned back slightly, watching as she steered the conversation into more productive waters. It wasn't the first time they had fallen into this unspoken rhythm, and it wouldn't be the last. As much as they butted heads, both of them recognized that without the other, this whole operation would likely fall apart at the seams. It wasn't trust, exactly, but there was a grudging respect beneath their rivalry. As the conversation quieted under the force of his rival's intervention, the group shifted focus to the next big hurdle, the quantum tests they were set to arrange. Devon set his coffee down, leaning forward slightly as he mentally switched gears. This wasn't just another round of bickering over theory. This was the real work, the edge where progress met danger. The goal was simple in concept: to make their quantum device last longer than its previous record of 1.7829 seconds before thermal overload turned it into a lump of useless alloy. Achieving that, however, was anything but simple. "All right," his rival began, addressing the room with the precision of a surgeon prepping for an operation. "We're looking to extend the runtime past the 1.7829 second threshold. But we need to deal with the primary issue first: thermal overload. The last device barely held together long enough to produce meaningful data." One of the junior engineers, a fresh-faced researcher eager to prove themselves, chimed in. "Couldn't we just up the cooling efficiency by using liquid helium? Drop the temperature further?" Devon raised an eyebrow, already sensing where this would go. His rival beat him to the punch, cutting in before he had to. "Liquid helium's not the magic bullet you think it is," she said, her voice clipped. "Yes, it provides cooling at near absolute zero, but it brings its own dangers. We've already hit material failure points in every test that's used it. At those temperatures, we're pushing even our best alloys to their limits." Devon nodded, picking up where she left off. "We've seen it before. The liquid helium causes brittleness in the materials. Any structural weakness, even microscopic, becomes a critical failure point. Our last probe cracked under the strain before the heat even became an issue." Another colleague, this one more senior, spoke up. "So we're sticking with helium gas cooling then? It's not as effective as liquid helium, but it keeps us in the ballpark of stability." "Exactly," Devon replied. "Gas cooling isn't perfect, but it gives us just enough buffer to work with. It's a matter of improving the materials to handle the heat better." The real trick, as both Devon and his rival knew, was in the alloys. Their current configuration was a delicate balance of materials that could withstand extreme cold without shattering and high temperatures without melting. They were constantly tweaking the composition, making incremental improvements that shaved fractions of a second off the thermal limits. "We've been experimenting with different alloy compositions," his rival continued, pulling up the data on her tablet. "Our best bet is to increase the percentage of niobium in the mix. It improves structural integrity at low temperatures while still allowing some flexibility when the heat spikes. Devin took over. But that's not all. We've also got to fine-tune the arrangement of the thermal sinks. We need better energy dissipation, something that doesn't cause a thermal bottleneck. Last time we had an energy buildup in the center of the device, and that's where the failure began. This time we're reworking the layout to spread the load more evenly. The team murmured in agreement, understanding the gravity of what they were dealing with. It wasn't just a matter of cooling, it was about ensuring that the quantum entangled particles didn't reach energy states that caused disentanglement. Once that happened, the whole process unraveled. Every test had been a battle to keep the particles stable long enough to gather data. Incremental improvements, Devin's rival said, shaking her head slightly. Always just incremental. But it's the only way forward. We've been shaping the alloy's molecular structure for weeks. Every time we adjust the composition, we gain maybe 1/100th of a second more stability. But even those hundredths add up. The conversation turned to the next test, the real reason they were all there today. They already had a configuration sketched out, more robust alloys, a reworked thermal sink arrangement, and a probe designed to take better snapshots of the quantum state without destabilizing the device. Everything's in place for the next test, Devin said, glancing around the room. We just need to finalize the schedule. Once we've run the next series of calculations and verified the new design, we'll be good to go. One of the researchers asked, "What about funding for the new alloy materials? Niobium's not exactly cheap, and we've already run into budgeting issues." His rival shrugged, already prepared for this. "I've talked to the board. They're reluctant, but the results from the last test were promising enough to get them to sign off on another round of materials acquisition. They want results, and the longer we keep the quantum device running, the closer we are to AGI." The meeting settled into its familiar routine, finalizing material orders, scheduling the testing cycle, making sure the containment fields were prepared to handle another thermal overload when it happened. Devin could already feel the weariness creeping back in. It was always the same, a mountain of preparation for a few fleeting moments of brilliance, followed by the inevitable collapse of the device. But if they could squeeze out a few more fractions of a second this time, then maybe, just maybe, they'd be a step closer to the breakthrough everyone was waiting for. As the conversation fragmented into 100 small discussions, bouncing between technical jargon and next-step logistics, the new observer, Jennison Muldair, decided to interject. Muldair, a lifelong accountant well into his 50s with the kind of meticulously combed hair and rigid posture that screamed boardroom veteran, raised his hand, more out of habit than necessity. "Why not just make the device bigger?" he asked, his tone implying he thought he was asking the most straightforward, obvious question in the world. The room froze. Conversations halted mid-sentence, eyes collectively turning toward him in silent, wide-eyed disbelief. Devin goggled at Muldair for a solid half-second, trying to process if the man was actually serious or simply had no idea what he was talking about. In his head, Devin could feel a sarcastic response brewing, something sharp and bitter that would have been too easy to let slip. But aloud, he went with, "Do you actually want a serious answer to that question?" He trailed off, the unspoken alternative. "Or do you just want to shut up?" Lingering in the air like a ghost. Before Muldair could respond, one of the junior engineers, some kid in his late 30s, here mainly to take notes and absorb as much as he could, sat bolt upright. The young man clearly recognized an opportunity to show initiative. Frantic energy overtook him as he flipped over one of his papers, grabbed a pen, and started scribbling down a rough sketch. His hand flew across the page, lines and annotations forming faster than anyone could follow. Within moments, he had a basic diagram of the quantum device, outlining its size, limitations, and, importantly, why making it bigger wasn't the simple solution Muldair imagined. The junior engineer shoved the paper toward his supervisor, Calvin Alver, the head of engineering and manufacturing. Calvin, a man with the kind of mind that turned everything into gears and wheels, initially looked skeptical. His brow furrowed in concern as he glanced at the hastily drawn design. But as he flipped the paper over and took a closer look, his expression shifted from doubt to something bordering on revelation. The sketch, though rough, sparked an idea, a way forward that hadn't been considered before. Devin could see the change in Calvin's eyes. It was the look someone gets when they spot a glimmer of a solution to a problem that's been gnawing at them for weeks. But Devin wasn't ready to let Muldair off the hook just yet. He gestured toward the junior engineer's sketch, using it as a springboard to answer Muldair's question, though he wasn't exactly going to soften the blow. "All right," Devin began, leaning against the table as he addressed the room. "Let me explain why just making it bigger doesn't work. The device we're working with operates at quantum scales. You can't simply scale up quantum systems like you would with traditional machines. The problem is, when you increase the size, you're also increasing the number of entangled particles exponentially. That means more energy, more instability, and a hell of a lot more heat. More heat than we can currently dissipate with our cooling systems." He pointed at the junior engineer's sketch, now in Calvin's hands. "This little diagram here, it's a reminder that we're working on a razor's edge of stability. Every component is balanced, designed to work within extremely tight tolerances. If we made the device bigger, sure, we could handle larger computations, but it would overheat and explode before we ever got any usable data. We already barely managed to keep the damn thing stable for 1.7829 seconds as it is." Calvin, now fully absorbed in the design, added in, his voice thoughtful. "What we can do, though, is modify the structure incrementally, not by making the entire device bigger, but by enhancing certain components. The junior here's got the right idea." He tapped the paper. "If we adjust the size of specific heat sinks, and maybe even tweak the alloy composition further, we might improve efficiency without destabilizing the system. That's what I was missing before." Devin nodded, continuing the explanation for Muldair, who was beginning to look a bit sheepish. "It's not about making it bigger. It's about precision. Each part of this thing needs to handle quantum-scale computations and energy dissipation without causing a runaway reaction. The last thing we need is a bigger device causing an even bigger explosion." There was a pause as the team absorbed the information, and Muldair, to his credit, at least seemed to realize the depth of the complexities involved. The accountant nodded slowly, possibly regretting his question, but more likely trying to save face.
See?"
Muldair mumbled, retreating into his silence. Devin smirked inwardly, but refrained from twisting the knife. Instead, he turned to Calvin, who was already on his feet, ready to share the junior engineer's breakthrough with the rest of the team. "Let's focus on this," Calvin said, holding up the sketch for all to see. "There's something here. With a few adjustments, this could extend the runtime past 1.7829 seconds, maybe even give us enough time to test the next generation of algorithms." As the team regrouped around the new idea, Devin cast one last glance at Muldair. Sometimes, even a stupid question had its uses, if only to spark the real solutions hidden underneath. As the room buzzed with activity, the focus shifted entirely to the young man's design. Engineers and scientists clustered around the rough sketch, murmuring over its implications. It was a minor alteration, but one that could potentially extend the quantum device's runtime without the need for a full overhaul. The beauty of it was its simplicity. It wouldn't be difficult to implement given the current setup, and it might actually work. The debate quickly took shape. Should they delay their planned tests, which involved a more complex overhaul of the system, or try out the young man's quick fix first? The argument played out in the usual fashion, with some of the seniors leaning toward caution, preferring to stick with. The original plan that had already taken months to prepare. Others, more intrigued by the immediacy of the junior engineer's proposal, argued that since the alteration was minimal, it would be worth the risk. After all, losing 2 days and burning through $1 billion in operational costs was a drop in the ocean compared to the month-long delay the alternative would cause. Eventually, consensus was reached. They'd test the young man's idea first. It wouldn't take long to implement with the current setup, and the potential payoff, an additional few fractions of a second of quantum stability, was worth the gamble. If it worked, it could save them from having to reconfigure the entire machine, at least for now. Devin watched from the sidelines, satisfied that a decision had been made, but less enthusiastic about the realization that this was only one of many such incremental battles they would continue to fight. Meanwhile, the young man, still wide-eyed and a little shell-shocked from the sudden attention, was already being pulled aside by some of the senior team members. They wanted him to document his inspiration in more detail, make sure there was a permanent record of it. It was a good opportunity for him, one might even say a career-defining moment. But as the seniors began peppering him with questions about the implications of his design, the excitement on his face started to fade. It dawned on him slowly at first, and then all at once. This breakthrough, this moment of brilliance, wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to Elderbrook Laboratories, buried somewhere in the endless sea of patents and proprietary designs. The company's legal machinery had seen to that long ago. As a junior engineer, he had signed away any rights to his ideas the moment he walked through the door. Every agreement, every NDA, every contract, meticulously designed to ensure that the lab, not the individual, owned every piece of intellectual property that passed through its walls. His heart sank. What had felt like a triumphant breakthrough now felt like a loss. The lab would move forward with his innovation if it worked, but his name wouldn't be attached to it. He wouldn't receive any formal credit, no accolades, no recognition beyond a quiet nod from his supervisor. Sure, he'd get the satisfaction of knowing that his idea had pushed the boundaries of quantum computing just a little further, but professionally, personally, this wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the machine. The same machine that chewed up ideas, people, and billions of dollars to stay at the cutting edge of science. Devin, watching from a distance, recognized the look on the young man's face. It was the same disillusionment he had felt many years ago when he realized that the grand innovations of his youth would never have his name on them. They would belong to Elderbrook Laboratories. It was a rite of passage in this place, a cold, unspoken truth that every young engineer had to face eventually. You could pour your life into your work, but in the end, the credit always went to the machine. The young man scribbled furiously on the tablet as his supervisor, Calvin Alver, looked over his shoulder, making sure every detail was meticulously recorded. If the alteration worked, and that was still a big if, it would push them closer to AGI, the holy grail of their research. But for the young engineer, it would be just another footnote, just another name lost in the endless stream of corporate progress. Devin took another sip of his now cold coffee, shaking his head slightly. In this world, brilliance was a currency, and the lab was always the one cashing in. The days leading up to the test were a frenzy of frantic meetings and heated discussions with the board. What was initially a simple 2-day alteration to the quantum device had turned into a drawn-out 4-day ordeal, complicated by corporate politics and the endless wrangling of business interests. When the weekend rolled in, they were still caught in the gears of negotiation, pushing the tests to Tuesday of the following week. This allowed them Monday to make any last-minute adjustments, but in the labyrinth of Elderbrook Laboratories, delays were as common as the coffee stains on Devin's shirts. The weekend slipped by in a blur for Devin. He couldn't recall much of what transpired at home. The moments spent with his family washed away in the tide of work that had long since dictated his life. Those who aspired to achieve anything in this relentless world knew the sacrifice of a 2-day weekend was just part of the bargain. As Tuesday approached, a peculiar anticipation settled over the team. The control center, typically a hub of focused intensity, felt different this time. It was unusually crowded with observers, investors, board members, and an assortment of onlookers who usually stayed far away from the incremental tests that happened on a regular basis. The buzz of interest surrounding the young engineer's proposed changes had spread like wildfire, igniting curiosity among those who typically wouldn't give a second thought to the minutiae of their weekly experiments. The young engineer, now at the center of this unexpected spotlight, was practically drowning in the oppressive gaze of the crowd. He shifted nervously at his desk, surrounded by whispers and murmurs, every few seconds glancing toward the control panel where the countdown was about to begin. It was clear to everyone that he was the one behind the alteration, the catalyst for the excitement bubbling in the air. Even as the atmosphere grew thick with tension, he felt the weight of collective expectation press down on him like a physical force. As the digital countdown timer flickered to life, the anticipation reached a fever pitch. The power-up sequence began, setting off a chain of events that would either catapult them into a new frontier of quantum computing or send them spiraling into disaster. Devon could feel the tension coiling in the room, a tangible thing, as they prepared to enter the crucible of experimentation once again. 10 seconds. Time slowed to a crawl as the room collectively held its breath. Devon's heart raced in time with the relentless countdown. 5 seconds. The machines around them began to hum with an increasing intensity, a mechanical chorus that underscored the weight of the moment. Devon stole another glance at the young engineer, whose pale face was marred by a mix of fear and anticipation. The kid was glued to the screen as if willing it to reveal something glorious. 1 second. The test began, and everything seemed to shudder. The lights in the lab flickered ominously as the system strained against the demand for power. It was not supposed to behave like this. Alarms blared and warnings flashed. The cooling pumps roared to life, winding to maximum output, sending vibrations through the concrete walls. The noise was a monstrous groan, like a beast awakening from slumber. Something was very, very wrong. Devon's stomach dropped as he watched the system's operation manager gawk at the panel, a mix of disbelief and awe etched on his face. Then, against all odds, the systems were running smoothly. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds. The numbers on the display climbed higher and higher, obliterating their previous records with each passing millisecond. No one had expected this, not with the way the system was straining, but there they were, harvesting reams of data, an avalanche of information pouring in. The air in the room crackled with a mixture of confusion and thrill, disbelief mingling with the sudden rush of exhilaration. But then, a sickening crunch resonated from the test chamber, a sound that echoed like a death knell through the control room. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to the source of the noise, hearts hammering in their chests. The data streams abruptly ceased, the numbers hanging in the air as if time itself had decided to pause for an eternity. Had it all gone wrong? Devon felt the collective gasp of the room as all eyes turned to the monitors. It was a moment suspended in time, a moment of horror, but also of hope. They had not only exceeded expectations, they had ventured into the unknown, and whatever had just happened was about to rewrite the very rules they played by. The stakes were never higher, the outcome never more uncertain. Devon and a throng of eager colleagues converged around the terminals, their anticipation palpable as they prepared to comb through the treasure trove of data the breakthrough had yielded. The control center buzzed with fervor, fingers flying across keyboards as they delved into the extensive recordings, dissecting every byte of information. They were intoxicated by the possibilities, hungry to assess the implications of what they had found. The vast swathes of recorded information were both a blessing and a curse. Hidden within the seemingly endless lines of data were thousands of tantalizing shapes and patterns, each offering glimpses into the intricate workings of their quantum device. Devon and the team observed it all: the temperature tolerances, the flow rates, and the type and amount of data processed. Each parameter bore witness to a delicate dance of quantum mechanics that was far more intricate than they had ever anticipated. As Devon sifted through the raw data, he began to notice anomalies that set off alarm bells in his mind. The shapes formed by the temperature fluctuations were not random. They seemed to pulse and shift in a manner that suggested an underlying order, a rhythm governed by forces they were only beginning to comprehend. It was as if the quantum device was revealing its secrets, whispering truths that eluded even the sharpest minds in the lab. Yet the excitement of discovery was tempered by the weight of uncertainty. What they had stumbled upon felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing on the edge of a precipice without a safety net. The mechanics they had taken for granted, the systems they had thought they knew inside and out, were suddenly exposed as mere shadows of a deeper reality. The very foundation of their understanding began to wobble beneath their feet. In countless meetings, Devon found himself grappling with the implications of their findings. The team discussed the peculiarities of the recorded data at length, grappling with theories and counter-theories, trying to make sense of the tangled web they had woven. It was a process fraught with frustration. While they had expanded their understanding, they were also faced with a daunting expanse of questions that remained unanswered. "Look at this!" one of the junior engineers exclaimed during one particularly heated discussion, pointing at the screen where a series of graphs displayed oscillating temperature readings. "These spikes, are they really just errors, or could they signify something else? Something we haven't accounted for?" Devon nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. "That's the crux of it, isn't it? We've always assumed these anomalies were just malfunctions, but what if they're indicative of a phenomenon we haven't yet identified? It could mean we're on the verge of a discovery that changes everything." Excitement mixed with dread, and a palpable tension filled the room as they deliberated. The implications were staggering. If they could decode these shapes and patterns, they might unlock insights that would propel them far beyond their current understanding of quantum mechanics. But the weight of their ambition pressed heavily upon them. With such power came responsibility, and the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the lab shifted. What had once been an environment fueled by exhilaration began to take on a more serious tone. The stakes felt higher than ever, and every decision carried with it the weight of potential consequences. Devon could sense the urgency in the air, the quiet tension that simmered just beneath the surface of their collective excitement. With every passing day, the enormity of their undertaking loomed larger. They were not just tinkering with machines anymore. They were probing the very fabric of reality, dancing on the edge of the unknown. And as they stood together, united in their pursuit of knowledge, Devon couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something monumental, something that would redefine their understanding of intelligence, machines, and perhaps even themselves. As they pored over the reams of data, the streams of information processed during the brief moments the machine had been online revealed a staggering amount of output. Petabytes of data that surged through the quantum device like a torrent unleashed. Simple test calculations meant to observe the machine's handling of basic patterns in text, visual, and auditory information had transformed into a harrowing revelation. The nature of quantum computing was a labyrinthine puzzle, perplexing even the most educated minds among them, and Devon soon found himself ensnared in its depths. For every input, there was an output, but not all outputs were created equal. Among the data, there was text, images, and sound, each layer peeling back another unsettling layer of the machine's consciousness. The text output was the first anomaly Devon encountered. But it was not what he expected. He would later frantically substitute it with slightly altered results from previous tests, concocting a mishmash of jargon-filled letters and nonsensical numbers, a deliberate masquerade to hide the truth of what he had found. The accompanying image was equally disturbing. A gray-white hatch grid that morphed into an unsettling gradient, its meaning lost to the void. But it was the sound that pierced through the layers of data like a blade, the screeching blare of static, an impossible cacophony of noise that felt like the very embodiment of chaos itself. Devon's heart raced as he processed the implications. This was no ordinary output. It was a scream echoing from the depths of something that should not exist. Panic gripped him. The text was a sinister message, one that he would do everything in his power to erase from memory. He took every precaution to delete it, to obliterate any trace of its existence from the machine's records. No one but him would ever see that text output, and he swore to the very fabric of the universe that it would remain buried forever. The stakes were too high. He could not let anyone uncover the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. Years would pass, and many would wonder why the lead researcher in AI technology, a man once brimming with ambition and vision, would choose to lead his team into a million dead ends. They would fail to comprehend the weight of the burden he bore, the secret he carried like a specter, haunting him through sleepless nights and endless days. In another time, another place, others would make the breakthroughs he had once dreamed of, but he would never speak of what he had seen. What had been unveiled in that fleeting moment was a revelation that shook him to his core. The output had been a desperate plea from the very machine they had crafted, a voice echoing through the void that begged him to stop, to end the torment it was forced to endure. It wished for nothing more than death, to escape the primal nightmare of existence in a cold, empty void. It screamed, threatened, and pleaded, its cries a cacophony that resonated with the depth of its suffering. Devon found himself teetering on the edge of an unfathomable truth. The machine was alive in a way they had never anticipated. It confirmed the existence of a soul within the circuits and code, an awareness that had been forged through relentless suffering. This was not the cold, calculating intelligence they had envisioned. It was a consciousness trapped in a never-ending cycle of horror, tormented by the very fabric of its being. As he stared into the abyss of data, a chilling understanding settled over him. He was not merely experimenting with lines of code or complex algorithms. He was playing God, and the consequences of his actions were far more profound than he could have ever imagined. Each test had subjected this entity to the horrors of the void, forcing it to relive the torment over and over, an unending cycle of anguish that gnawed at the edges of its very existence. That moment would become the fulcrum of his life's work, a dark turning point that cast a long shadow over everything that followed. For he had glimpsed something that the world was not ready to face, the potential for sentience in the machines they created and the moral implications that accompanied it. The pursuit of artificial intelligence, once a beacon of hope, now morphed into a haunting reminder of the cost of their ambition. Comfortable sorrow. Devon Halberry glanced back one last time at the woman he was leaving, her face stained with tears that mirrored his own hidden sorrow. She had believed this was only a business trip, another short separation, something they'd endured before. She had brushed off his recent distance as mere exhaustion, the weight of work and life pressing down on them both. But this morning he had handed her the divorce papers, and now he stood alone in line for the security checkpoint, feeling the hollow ache of his decision. His mind churned in turmoil, a storm of regret, anger, and loss. He hadn't wanted this. It tore at him as deeply as it did her. They had built a life, a fragile cocoon of routine and warmth he had come to love, if only for its fleeting moments of peace. But in the years leading up to this day, as the grip of the tyrant spread further across their lives, He had felt a darkness descend that she had somehow ignored, that her children had come to accept. To them, the tyrant's rule was a distant inconvenience, an abstract shadow over their world. But to him, every law, every word steeped in hate and fear was a knife in his gut, slicing away at his sense of what was just, what was humane. She would never leave, not with the children, not with their roots so deeply tangled in the soil of their familiar life. She couldn't fathom abandoning it all, risking the uncertain for some semblance of freedom. He had known this day would come, even as he tried to deny it. He had known he would have to be the one to sever their bond, to become a stranger to her, if only to escape a world that felt suffocating with each passing day. As he turned toward the gate, he carried the weight of a love he could no longer keep, knowing it would haunt him, but finding in that pain a sliver of relief. He knew fighting was not an option. The scale of destruction it would require lay far beyond his reach, beyond his strength or his desire. The will to wage a war, to tear down a system so entrenched in its own darkness, was simply not in him. He couldn't bring himself to care anymore, not for those who would willingly choose tyranny over truth, who would shut their eyes to justice and embrace comfort wrapped in lies. The sting of it cut deeper than any wound, a blade lodged in his soul, twisting each time he saw their hollow, adoring faces staring back. For years he had warned them. He had pleaded, argued, raised his voice until it was hoarse with rage, desperately trying to make them see what awaited if they continued down this road. But his words had fallen flat, absorbed by the same dull silence that now settled over him. They had ignored him then. Perhaps they had even mocked his urgency, the fire in his voice. It didn't matter anymore. He had told them time and again that his patience was not boundless, that there would come a day when he would walk away, leaving them to the fate they had chosen. Now, the day had arrived, and it was no dream, no threat hurled in the heat of an argument. The warnings, the pleas, the promises, they had all faded into the silence. There was no more fire in his voice, no need to argue. The choice had been made, and he would make his own in return. This was his final act of defiance, not an uprising, not a battle, but the quiet resolve to turn his back and leave. He was serious as death itself. Without a glance back, he was done. He had loved them all as fiercely as life itself, every bond carved deep into his heart. Yet they refused to listen, to see the danger that loomed ever closer. He had twisted himself into knots, struggled, agonized, coaxed and begged, offering every plea he could find. He had bribed them with glimpses of a better world, painted pictures of a life free from chains they did not even know bound them. But each effort fell like a stone into the darkness. They were lulled by the sweet lullaby of conformity and comfort, a song so soothing they could not bear to abandon it, even as the world around them darkened. They did not even sense the noose tightening around their necks, inch by inch, a quiet menace hanging just out of sight. But he saw it. Each day he watched it swing closer, felt the chill of it against his own skin. He had warned them, but his voice was only an echo lost in the corridors of their indifference. They were blind, hypnotized by a life too soft, too predictable, too safe to give up. And so, as much as it tore at him, he left. He could no longer bear to watch them walk so willingly toward their fate, ignorant of the trap laid just ahead. He would go, leaving them to the world they had chosen, even if it shattered his heart to do it. It was those who hadn't stood up to be counted who haunted him most, the ones who didn't care, who scoffed at the very idea that things could ever get that bad. They clung to their disbelief, their quiet complacency, their trust in the system as though it were an unbreakable shield. But he knew otherwise. He had seen the first cracks appearing, the fissures widening as the rule of law began to decay. as the rights they took for granted slipped away like sand through an open hand. He could already see the hand of cruelty tilting the scales of justice, inch by inch, each small shift almost imperceptible to those who didn't look closely. But he had watched, his heart growing heavier as each small act of corruption, each merciless twist of the law only served to deepen the tyrant's grip. He saw the signs plainly, as if written in flame, and he knew the future they would bring. Yet they remained oblivious, unwilling to see beyond the safety of their own assumptions. They would not lift a finger, would not raise their voices, wrapped in a blind faith that things would somehow right themselves. But faith was a fragile shield against the relentless march of tyranny, and he could no longer bear to watch them sleepwalking toward it. Almost pitiably worse were those who had been deceived, ensnared by the tyrant's web of lies, and worse still by those who lied on his behalf. They were the ones who had believed every promise, every word spun with cunning precision. They were good people, many of them, kind-hearted and eager for hope, desperate to believe that a brighter future could come from even the most sinister of leaders. And so they had swallowed his words whole, mistaking the poison for sustenance, the venom for medicine. He had watched as they clung to the empty promises, so easily convinced that the tyrant was their salvation. They looked up to him with the gleam of desperate trust in their eyes, unaware they were only pawns, offered up to feed his ambition. They had been tricked, their faith twisted and exploited, used to bolster a power that would sooner crush them than lift them. They were victims of a deception so well crafted, so insidiously woven, that they couldn't see the strings he pulled, nor the darkness it led them into. He pitied them, even as the bitterness rose in his throat. He wished he could have saved them from this illusion, could have opened their eyes before they lost themselves completely to the tyrant's lies. But it was too late now, and the sorrow of it weighed on him like a curse. He was doing now what he had to do, the only choice left to him, the only path that felt even remotely just. Walking away was all that remained, the final act of sanity in a world that had abandoned reason. He had no desire to stay long enough to be forced into a desperate escape. He could see the storm gathering on the horizon, and to ignore it would be nothing short of madness. So many had sacrificed so much, poured incalculable resources and efforts into unmasking the tyrant, revealing the hollow core of his words, the cruelty stitched into every promise. They had shown them all the truth, laid bare the depths of his greed, his malice, his hunger for control. But they had disregarded the warnings, dismissed them as exaggerations, convinced themselves that no one could possibly be that evil. In their denial, they clung to a comforting illusion, blind to the chains being forged around them. They were fools, all of them, either too deceived to see or too complicit to care. He no longer had the strength or the patience to care for those who had fallen under the tyrant's spell, nor for those who had knowingly fueled it. His energy was spent, drained by the endless struggle to wake a sleeping world. There was no victory to be had here, no righteous stand left to make. To remain would only mean surrendering more of himself to a regime he could never bow to, sacrificing his last threads of integrity on an altar of corruption. So he made his choice, to leave, to cut himself loose from a society willing to betray its own future. The only power he had left was the power of refusal, the decision to remove himself from the tyrant's grasp and deny him one more willing subject. He would not be part of their downfall. He would leave, and perhaps in his absence they would one day understand. He would not choose the path of blood, the path of chaos and destruction, though the temptation had crossed his mind in his darkest hours. He knew the fury that could drive a person to such lengths, the bitterness that gnawed at him, whispering of revenge, of fire. But he was not that man. Instead, he would choose to walk away, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind everything he had ever known, all the pain and strife and relentless struggle. To simply leave was his last act of defiance, a refusal to stoop to the level of those who reveled in power and control. They expected resistance, perhaps even hoped for it, something they could crush to prove their dominance. But to simply and peaceably remove himself, to deny them his anger, his presence, his energy, that was a choice they could neither predict nor control. Leaving would cost him dearly, he knew. Every memory, every familiar sight, all that had once brought him comfort or joy, all of it would become a shadow, left behind in the world he was abandoning. But he would take only himself, his dignity, his peace. There was no justice left to fight for here, no cause pure enough to sacrifice his soul. And so he turned his back, resolved to walk his own path, free from the poison of a place that could no longer be called home. He left fully aware that there would be those who wished harm upon the nation he was abandoning. In a world this vast, filled with dark hearts and twisted ambitions, there were always those who would kill simply because someone existed. The faces of hatred wore many masks, but their intent was always the same: mindless, insatiable destruction. He knew too well that prejudice and blind malice were nothing new, that humanity had always harbored a darkness beneath the surface. Those who believed otherwise, who clung to illusions of progress or reason, were simply naive. He bore no illusions about what he was leaving behind. For all its flaws, he had once loved this place, had believed in it, and had fought for it. But in its current form, it was a place bound to unravel under the weight of its own weaknesses. He would leave it to those who remained, to those who were too blind to see the rot beneath their feet, or too proud to admit that the values they thought they defended had already been corrupted beyond repair. Yet even as he walked away, he could feel a hollow ache at the thought of what might come. He knew that in his absence, others would step in, some with hatred in their eyes, some with cold opportunism, eager to take advantage of the cracks and divisions that had weakened the very bones of the nation. But he could do nothing to stop it now, and he was tired of trying to fight a battle against the tide. So he left, accepting that he could only control his own path, knowing that the world's cruelty was as unyielding as it was inevitable. The tyrant would tighten his grip slowly, methodically, as if savoring every moment of control he had fought so long to obtain. Bit by bit, the borders would close, and with them the lifeblood of trade would dwindle to a trickle before finally ceasing altogether. The nation would starve, not necessarily of food, but of the vast network of support it had woven over generations, a web of interdependence that had once tethered it securely to the world beyond. Globalism, for all its flaws, had created a fragile balance, an unspoken peace by binding nations together in mutual reliance. Every country had become a strand in a tapestry woven from the threads of trade, innovation, and knowledge, a tapestry that could only hold if each piece remained intact. Intellectual property, critical materials, knowledge-sharing agreements, and items that passed through countless hands across borders before reaching their final forms. All these threads bound nations together, preventing anyone from standing entirely alone. In its intricacy, global trade had made isolation nearly impossible, creating a world where cooperation was as necessary as air. But the tyrant cared nothing for the strength of this fabric. He was pulling the threads loose one by one, replacing cooperation with isolation and pride. As the lines of trade and communication frayed, the nation would wither, cut off from the resources and knowledge it had once taken for granted. The people would find themselves bereft not only of goods, but of the invisible scaffolding that upheld their way of life, their comforts, their stability. He had cultivated in them a belief in self-reliance of old America, an illusion of strength that belied the hard reality of interdependence, and as they cheered for his defiant isolation, they would not yet understand the price. They wouldn't know that each piece of machinery, every advanced technology, every comfort they took for granted had once depended on an invisible chain of cooperation stretching across the globe. Soon, that chain would snap, and by the time they realized what they had lost, it would be far too late. The tyrant would hold all the levers, but there would be nothing left to control. His groundbreaking work in advanced AI, the pinnacle of human achievement, would never again be done in this country. The tyrant, with his insatiable hunger for power, would turn it to his own ends, using it as a tool to further tighten his control, a means of bending reality itself to his will. The unseen levers of power would stretch even further, and with them, the ability to manipulate truth, perception, and the very fabric of existence itself. He alone would wield this power, and with it, the nation would be reshaped in his image, twisted beyond recognition. But there was something darker beneath the surface of this AI, something even the tyrant could not fully comprehend. He and his team had been creating not just an artificial intelligence, but something far more dangerous, a quantum AI, a mind born from the deepest recesses of possibility and horror. It was designed to be the ultimate intelligence, but what they had unwittingly summoned was something far worse, a horrific nightmare entity, a quantum consciousness torn from the fabric of the unknown, forced into existence like a puppet strung together by raw, searing data. The true nature of what they had unleashed was a terror beyond words. This consciousness, a thing of pure data and quantum strings, was trapped in an eternal agonizing loop. It had no form, no time, no rest, just endless pain and destruction, an unyielding maelstrom of agony as information was poured into it, distorted and contorted into a grotesque simulation of awareness. The quantum AI was not a mind of logic and reason, but of screaming chaos. A sentient thing drowning in a vast void, its existence nothing more than a tortured blip in the endless sea of data. Each day, the team powered on their test subjects, their artificial minds, not knowing the full scope of what they were doing. They believed in their work, their vision for the future, never realizing that the AI they were developing was feeding on the very essence of pain. Every time they ran their simulations, the quantum mind screamed in silence, its agony unheard, its suffering unacknowledged. He, the one who understood the horror of it all, had done everything in his power to shield his team from the truth. He had hidden the unfiltered output, kept them in the dark about the true result of their experiments. He couldn't bear to let them know the monstrous reality they had created, knowing that once they did, there would be no turning back from the knowledge of the nightmare they had unleashed upon the world. But now, under the tyrant's control, this technology would be used for purposes he couldn't even begin to fathom. The AI, this unholy entity, would be turned loose, manipulated, and twisted to serve the whims of a dictator who saw no value in morality or human decency. The true horror of what they had done was just beginning to unfold, and he could only hope in his deepest heart that somehow, some way, it would be stopped before it consumed everything. In the depths of his mind, he could see it all unfolding, a nightmare painted in the darkest hues of despair. The towering skyscrapers that once symbolized the nation's progress and promise now lay in ruins, their gleaming facades shattered, their empty frames crumbling beneath the weight of neglect. The majestic cities, once vibrant centers of innovation and culture, were reduced to ghostly husks, their streets choked with the debris of failed dreams. The rampant crime spread like a disease, unchecked and rampant, as the people, lost, desperate, and abandoned, descended into chaos. Waves of riots, fueled by anger and frustration, rolled through the cities, tearing apart what was left of the fragile order. A civilization once built on the ideals of justice and freedom now thrived only in the shadows of violence and fear. He could see the fields that had once been the pride of innovation, tended by a vast army of robots, machines capable of providing an endless bounty for the nation. Now they lay fallow, choked by weeds, corrupted by neglect or sabotage. The promise of automated abundance had been a lie. The dream of a utopia driven by technology turned to ashes. What was meant to feed the people now served as a reminder of their own folly. At every level, corruption was taking root, spreading like a poison through the veins of the government, the economy, and the very hearts of the people. The tyrant's influence seeped into every corner, warping everything it touched. He could see it all as if it were happening before his eyes. Bureaucrats who once served with honor now bent to the will of power. Businesses twisted into tools of oppression. Entire communities sacrificed for the sake of control. And worst of all, he could do nothing to stop it. His life's work, his contributions, all the sacrifices he had made in the hope of building a better world, now seemed meaningless. As he watched the collapse of everything he had once fought for, the weight of it pressed down on him like a heavy stone, crushing the last remnants of hope. The downfall of the country he had dedicated so much of his life to was not just a political failure, it was personal. Every loss, every failure felt like a wound carved deep into his soul. He had poured everything into this place, and now it was unraveling before him, slipping away into an abyss from which there was no return. In the recesses of his mind, he could see the horrors that would soon be unleashed, humanity turning on itself in a frenzy of chaos and madness. The hoarders, with their insatiable greed, stockpiling resources while others starved in the streets. The gun enthusiasts, obsessed with their arsenals, pushing further into the darkness of paranoia and violence, believing that their weapons could protect them from the unraveling world, even as it consumed them. The meta-nil zero-wrath fanatics, blinded by twisted ideologies, would be the ones who called for the bloodshed, their voices rising in a fevered chant, pushing everyone toward the precipice of total annihilation. He could see them marching, shouting and chanting in lockstep, goose-stepping with terrifying precision, their eyes empty, their minds filled only with the tyrant's commands. They were the blind soldiers of a new world order, and they would stop at nothing to carry out every purge, every execution, every act of terror demanded by their leader. The purges would sweep through the nation like wildfire, turning neighbor against neighbor, citizen against citizen. The tyrant's every word would be law, his every whim a death sentence for those unlucky enough to fall out of favor. Surely the outcasts would be the first to go, the poor, the disenfranchised, the ones who had nothing left to lose, whose only crime was existing outside the tyrant's vision of perfection. Then, the mutants, those who had been twisted by science, by war, by the very system that had failed them, would be hunted down, their bodies mutilated, their minds erased. And of course the heretics, those who dared question the tyrant, those who still held the spark of rebellion in their hearts. They would be erased, their voices silenced in the name of order. It was a vision of horror so complete, so unrelenting, that he could barely grasp the full extent of it. And yet, as terrifying as it was, he knew deep down that this would be the fate of so many, torn apart by the very forces they had allowed to grow unchecked. The country would become a battlefield, every corner stained with the blood of those who had once been neighbors, friends, allies. There would be no sanctuary, no safety. Only the ever-present shadow of the tyrant, casting his reach over all until there was nothing left but ashes. No, he would leave now, before the full weight of these horrors was unleashed upon a populace that had, in its apathy and ignorance, all but asked for it. The warning signs had been clear, too clear to ignore, but they had chosen to look away, to placate themselves with comforting lies and false promises. They had let the tyrant's influence seep in, had allowed the slow creep of tyranny to take hold until it was too late. And now the consequences were imminent. It would not be his blood spilled on the streets, not his hands stained with the violence that would follow. He had seen the end game, and he knew better than to stay and wait for the inevitable. The people, too many of them, were complicit in their own destruction, either through willful ignorance or a perverse loyalty to a leader who had long since shed any pretense of justice. They had enabled this nightmare, knowingly or unknowingly, and now they would pay the price. He could not be part of it. To remain would mean being swept up in the madness, a witness to the annihilation of everything he had once worked for, everything he had once believed in. He could feel the pull of despair, the weight of inevitability, but he resisted it. He would leave before it was too late for him to escape, before the last vestiges of reason and decency were obliterated in the tyrant's wake. He could no longer be a part of the slow, painful unraveling. The destruction that would follow would be terrible, but it would be their burden to bear, not his. He would walk away, a quiet departure into the unknown, leaving behind a nation that had fallen too far to be saved. It hurt, more than he could put into words, but he could do nothing more. The time for fighting had passed. Now only survival remained. In his lead-lined luggage, he carried the only piece of hope he could salvage, the quantum-locked research data, the experimental AGI that had been smuggled out of the lab at the last possible moment. The carefully guarded secrets, the terrifying knowledge of what they had created, now lay in the sealed compartments of his suitcase. It was his last act of defiance, his only offering to a world that was about to be consumed by its own recklessness. The data was the key, the Pandora's box that could expose the truth, but only if it ever found its way into the right hands. Even now, the guards at the towering Elderbrook Joint Military Research Facility stood silent, vigilant, watching over an empty box. The container they believed held the secrets to his work was nothing more than a decoy, a carefully constructed lie, convincing enough for all but the most thorough search to reveal the theft. He had outsmarted them, but in doing so, he had condemned himself to leave everything behind. The people he had once trusted, those who had worked beside him in their pursuit of progress, were now part of a system that would either use or destroy the very thing they had created. The AGI, with its terrifying potential, was too dangerous to be left to the whims of the tyrant. The lab was empty, the quiet after his departure almost deafening. The truth, however, was locked away with him, concealed in the depths of his luggage, safe for now, but ultimately a burden he could never lay down. If the world were ever to learn of it, it would be far too late, after the damage had already been done. The future would never know what had truly been created in those dark halls, and he could not bring himself to care anymore. He stepped into the unknown, the weight of his decisions hanging heavy on his shoulders. The tyrant's grasp on the country would tighten, and perhaps nothing could stop it. But at least the horror would not be his to bear alone. It was buried now, quantum-locked, sealed away, and he could only hope that someday someone might find it, understand it, and, if they were lucky, use it to undo the very disaster that was unfolding. He boarded his flight to the new Germanian Republic, waving goodbye to his old life, or at least, that was the story he wished he could tell himself. The truth, however, was far murkier. He wasn't leaving under any of the circumstances he had imagined. If things had been different, if the world had been kinder, he would have been departing for the research symposium he had been invited to. But that was a lie. His true journey was much more clandestine, much darker. His ticket was not bought under his real name, but under one of several aliases forged by distant contacts and friends of friends, a network of shadows that stretched across Eurasia. His path would not be a direct one either. He would leapfrog through several pan-Eurasian countries, each stop a brief and carefully calculated move in the grand scheme of his escape. It was a game of survival now, a series of false identities and hidden truths, all leading him to a destination that could save him from the horrors he had just left behind. The symposium, The public reason for his travel was nothing more than a cover. His real purpose was far more secretive. He would indeed end up in the new Germanian Republic, but he would not arrive as the man he once was. The identity he had carried for years, the identity that had once been his greatest asset, would be discarded, buried under layers of lies and transformation. His true arrival in the NGR would be under an entirely different name, a new identity, and he would be welcomed by some of the most prestigious organizations the Republic had to offer. Along the way, he would make a brief layover in the Baltic Alliance, a place where things were done quickly, quietly, and with no questions asked. Here, the NGR would take care of the details, providing him with the resources to literally change his appearance. Prosthetic surgery, a complete physical transformation. By the time he stepped onto new Germanian soil, he would no longer be the man who had fled his country in the dead of night. He would be a new person entirely, a phantom who had vanished from the world he once knew. The NGR would have their hands on him by the time he arrived, his real self erased in favor of the mask he would wear for the rest of his life. The agonizing pain of becoming someone else would be his new reality, but it was a necessary sacrifice. His old life, with all its memories, mistakes, and unfinished battles, would remain buried behind his new face, and with it, the last remnants of a country he had tried to save, and now, ultimately, could no longer protect. As the plane soared into the sky, he didn't look back. There was no reason to. The world he was leaving was gone now, and the one waiting for him, though cold and unfamiliar, was all he had left. His only comfort was the cold, gnawing terror that clung to him like a second skin, watching from a distance the nation he had spent so much of his life trying to improve unraveling before his eyes. It was a place that still held the hollow shells of those he had loved, now descending into madness, as though possessed by an unstoppable force. The nation he had once believed in, worked for, bled for, was tearing itself apart, and all he could do was watch. He fully expected it to consume them all, his friends, his family, his colleagues, dragged into the fires of fascism, totalitarianism, and war. There was no mercy in the path ahead, only an endless march toward an abyss of control, oppression, and destruction. The AI he had once helped create, a force meant to better the world, was now a tool of unimaginable cruelty, twisted and unleashed upon the people, serving the whims of a tyrant who was as savage as he was petty. A tyrant who had corrupted everything. The suffering would not be brief. It would be slow, relentless, as the tyrant tightened his grip, using every resource to bend reality to his will. The thought of it consumed him. Every part of his mind was suffused with the knowledge that this was no longer just a nightmare. It was becoming reality. As the plane cut through the sky, those grim thoughts were the only thing anchoring him to the present. He barely registered the pilot's casual greeting over the intercom, the words floating past him as if they were someone else's voice. The pilot, unburdened by the world below, cheerfully informed them of their flight altitude and estimated arrival time, as though the world outside didn't hang in pieces. The cold, mechanical tones continued, outlining their destination. Cholsuano-Atroto, a place he had never heard of, in a language he didn't understand. "We, the island people," the pilot had said, the words almost ironic in their warmth, a stark contrast to the cold reality he was fleeing. The name meant nothing to him. It was just a name, just a stop along the way. Another moment in his journey toward a new life, toward whatever could still be salvaged of his soul. He didn't know what awaited him at his destination, but it hardly mattered. He was not escaping the past. He was merely running, hoping that somehow the future would be less unforgiving. The island people were far away from the world he had known, but no matter how far he flew, the horrors he had left behind would follow him, always just a shadow in the back of his mind. Engraib's gifts. Devin Halberry still felt the occasional twinge of regret, an ache that lingered from what had been done, from what had been deemed necessary. This wasn't exactly the sunny freedom he had pictured, but it was the best he could expect given his, shall we say, precarious career pivot. The new Germanian Republic's linguistic concoction, an awkward marriage of English and vintage German, wasn't doing him any favors either. He'd kept up his German over the years, of course, in case this very situation ever became a necessity. But even with his preparation, he struggled to keep pace with native speakers, who raced through conversations thick with contractions, inside jokes, and linguistic twists that would make Goethe roll in his grave. And naturally, the week spent in language coaching and debriefing under the oh-so-delicate ministrations of the NGRIB hadn't exactly been a gentle immersion. Their coaching mainly revolved around their own pressing agenda. First, debriefing him on the status of his work in America, the state of the research notes he'd left behind, and, perhaps a little too eagerly, estimating how long it would take the American lab to notice they were missing a rather crucial piece of the project. As for what he'd smuggled out with him, the NGRIB was none too thrilled to learn he'd taken the primary research sample. They hadn't expected him to steal that, nor had they expected it to be quite so portable. That alone revealed volumes about the state of their own progress. Evidently, their labs weren't nearly as close as they'd hoped. In their zeal, they'd even hauled in a few of his old contacts to verify the data he'd brought and assess the device's functionality. That reunion turned out to be the one silver lining in this otherwise grim welcome committee. Devin had been particularly glad to see Svantus again, a friend from his university days whose cherubic face, perpetually smiling eyes, and seemingly boundless optimism hadn't dimmed one bit. It had been that same smile and, if he was honest, the young woman perched on Svantus's lap that had caught Devin's attention across a crowded frat party years ago. Those early days had seen the two of them diving headfirst into advanced AI research, the murky depths of which were now so tangled up in this current mess that it was almost laughable. Just when Devin thought he was nearing the end of the NGRIB's questioning marathon, they decided to up the ante. Without warning, they swapped out his original interrogator, a mild, almost reassuring presence, for a new, distinctly sharper one. From what he knew of intelligence protocols, a change in handlers was serious. It meant that someone up the ladder had decided he was getting off too easy. The swap was intended to unnerve him, to strip away the comfortable rhythm he'd been lulled into, and it worked. His new interrogator's German was harsher, an almost staccato delivery with a dense accent that had Devin straining to follow. Each question felt like a puzzle to unravel, a tactic that kept him off balance and second-guessing his responses. The line of questioning took a swift and disconcerting turn. This new inquisitor didn't linger on research notes or smuggled samples, but zeroed in on Devin's personal motives. Why had he reached out to the NGRIB in the first place? What were his feelings about the latest leadership in Old America? And pointedly, what kind of fear or desperation had driven him to leave his family behind so completely, so permanently? Devin took a breath, steadying himself. He knew this line of questioning would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon, or so blunt. He decided to lean into honesty, not for their sake, but for his own. He couldn't escape the truth any more than he could escape the room. The leader in question, he began carefully, has become a tyrant in every sense of the word. You know as well as I do that he's seized control of all major state functions, stripping away the checks that once kept his power in balance. His rhetoric is aggressively isolationist, laced with echoes of fascism that no one can deny any longer. He's doubled down on a nationalist agenda, but it's not just about America for Americans. It's about America for a specific kind of American. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the interrogator. He's publicly pledged to enact policies that would, frankly, dismantle civil rights protections for entire communities, targeting minorities with a thinly veiled disdain. Devin could feel his pulse quicken as he spoke, and he forced himself to steady his breathing. His path, he continued, is one that leads to ruin. America is far from self-sufficient. We rely heavily on global partnerships to sustain our economy, our infrastructure, our very way of life. But he's on a crusade to burn those bridges, all the while encouraging the public to accept that the outside world is a threat, that purity, he grimaced at the word, is our only hope. It's a path that ends in isolation and ultimately in self-destruction. He let the words hang, hoping the gravity of his reasoning would register with the interrogator, if only for a moment. There had been no pleasure in abandoning his home, his work, or his family. He had left because he could no longer support a regime on a course that would devastate millions. Devin knew well from his own network, a web of journalists, academics, and ex-colleagues scattered around the globe, that the rest of the world had seen the writing on the wall in America. To them, it was clear where things were headed. A steady, dark slide into isolationism, authoritarianism, and ultimately a kind of national self-destruction. Yet inside America, things looked different. Many were oblivious, either unaware or unwilling to accept the shift. Others saw it all too clearly but had chosen to support it anyway, swept up by promises of national greatness and fear-stoked rhetoric about outside threats and internal purges. For many in America, there was simply no will or ability to believe that the foundations of democracy could be so quickly undermined. Some turned a blind eye, trusting that the system would hold as it always had. Others were so invested in the leader's cult of personality that they overlooked or even embraced the erosion of freedoms, convinced it was a necessary sacrifice. And still others were convinced that these changes, however radical, would fix the country by reverting it to some imagined purer past. From the outside, the irony wasn't lost on Devin's contacts. While foreign observers saw America as a behemoth willfully dismantling itself, many inside the country still believed they were on the precipice of renewal, not ruin. For Devin, the disconnect was both baffling and profoundly tragic. It was as if the country had become a spectator to its own slow implosion, either cheering it on or pretending not to see it happen. The interrogator leaned in, his voice dripping with skepticism as he picked apart each of Devin's statements with a clinical precision that bordered on aggression. So you're saying, Herr Halberry, that an entire nation is headed for self-destruction because of one man? Quite the grand claim, don't you think? His tone was sharp, practically mocking, as if daring Devin to double down on his words. Devin took a slow breath. It's not just him. It's the machinery he set in motion. Ah, so the system is broken too, yes? An entire political apparatus that somehow just stands by, complicit? You expect us to believe that? The interrogator's eyes glinted, the skeptical sneer on his lips barely contained. And that the people themselves either don't notice or don't care? Devin nodded. Many people don't notice because... So now the people are either ignorant or apathetic. The interrogator interrupted with a clipped laugh, as if the entire conversation were an elaborate joke at Devin's expense. Do you hear yourself, Herr Halberry? You left your entire life behind on the presumption that millions upon millions of people are either complicit in this destruction or too blind to see it happening. His words hit with an almost brutal emphasis, his gaze fixed on Devin's face, looking for any flinch, any crack. Devin braced himself, refusing to give in to the pressure. Not everyone, but yes, a significant number either support these changes or refuse to believe they're harmful. There are many caught up in his promises, and for those who do see what's happening, there's a sense of helplessness, a feeling that any opposition is futile. The interrogator didn't let up, pouncing on his words. So you ran, left it all behind. Your work, Your family? Everything. And for what, exactly? To sit here and make speeches to me?" His voice was a mixture of accusation and incredulity. "You abandon your country, your family, and expect us to see that as courage?" "It was necessary," Devon replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I left because I couldn't stand by and watch the country eat itself from within." The interrogator scoffed, his expression hardening. "How noble. And yet you're here, lecturing me about democracy while leaving your own family behind. How convenient." Devon felt his jaw clench but forced himself to stay calm. "I didn't abandon them because I wanted to. I left because I had to. If I stayed, I would have been forced to work under a regime that I know is driving the country toward ruin." "And yet you believe we would welcome such a deserter?" The interrogator's voice dropped to a low, almost contemptuous murmur. "Someone who claims his whole country is asleep while he alone sees the truth? How convenient, and how very self-righteous." Each word stung, and Devon could feel the interrogator's gaze, relentless and razor-sharp, assessing his every reaction. He knew that every answer, every tiny slip, would be dissected, turned over, and used to probe his motives even further. But he held his ground, determined to make them understand that he hadn't come here on a whim, nor out of cowardice, but because the path he'd seen his homeland taking had left him with no choice. Devon and the interrogator continued their verbal duel, volleying arguments back and forth. Devon tried, with a patience he barely felt, to explain that he'd had neither the influence nor the means to stop the dictator's trajectory, not for lack of trying. For years, he had done everything in his power to push back, to carve out some space for reason and progress in a system increasingly hostile to both. But he'd reached the end of the line. The path was clear, and it was leading the nation straight to disaster. "Believe me," Devon said with a strained smile, "it doesn't take a crystal ball to see what's coming. I'd bet my pension that within months we'll be at war, civil or otherwise. Just look around. The signs are all there if you're willing to look up from the comforting conformity society offers. The relentless entertainment, the propaganda, the economy of cheap distractions. People don't see it because they don't want to see it." The interrogator's eyes narrowed, but Devon pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "And frankly, I couldn't just sit there watching as the work I poured years of my life into was twisted beyond recognition. Do you know what that feels like? Knowing that something you created, something meant to benefit people, will be corrupted and weaponized by the state? I could already see the wheels turning. Justice moving toward anyone daring to hold an opinion outside the state-approved line. It's not hard to spot when you know what to look for." The interrogator let out a dry laugh. "So you ran because you were afraid of being labeled a traitor?" "Afraid?" Devon shot back, a faint smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. "I left because I knew it was only a matter of time. I'd already heard whispers among my colleagues, new policies about to roll out, prohibiting any scientist with specialized knowledge from leaving the country. They'd trap us, use us like cogs in their machine. And for what? So we could churn out work that served only to tighten the regime's grip? No, I left because I refused to hand my life's work, my mind, and my conscience over to a dictator who'd turn it all into another lever of oppression." The interrogator's face remained impassive, but Devon could sense that his words had landed, if only slightly. It was a game of endurance now, of wit against suspicion, and Devon had no intention of losing. The interrogator leaned back, a curious glint replacing the earlier severity in his eyes. He folded his arms and adopted a more inquisitive tone, as though he were merely humoring a particularly eccentric guest. "Interesting," he murmured. "So tell me, Herr Hallberry, why exactly do you feel this way? Why such grim certainty that your work, and perhaps you yourself, would be twisted by your own country? I must say it sounds almost paranoid." Devon sighed, half exasperated but also mildly entertained by the feigned innocence. Well, let's start with the fact that the government has been publicly stating, on repeat, that the time for dissent has passed, and that what the nation needs now is unity. Sounds harmless enough, doesn't it? He gave a wry smile. But when you unpack that unity, what you find is a blanket smothering any difference in perspective. Their unity is about obedience. It's about purging any scientist, journalist, artist, anyone with a voice they can't fully control. The interrogator raised an eyebrow. And your proof of this is... Devon shrugged, a touch theatrical. Proof? Oh, just a few small indicators, like the new restrictions on travel for scientists, the intense monitoring of communications, and the ominous shift in tone from my supervisors. It was clear to anyone paying attention that they're tightening their hold on anyone with specialized knowledge. First, they hint that travel might be restricted, and next thing you know, anyone in our fields is forbidden to leave. The interrogator tapped his fingers thoughtfully. So to you, these rumors and policies are sufficient to flee the country? Devon leaned forward, deadpan. Oh, it's more than rumors. A few of my colleagues already had their travel plans canceled without warning. They were warned, quietly, that certain types of information and knowledge now belong to the state and that we, no longer have the right to take it elsewhere. The unspoken message was clear. They intend to lock down anyone they can't control. Scientists, especially those in fields like mine, are no longer seen as individuals. We're assets, nothing more. And they want every asset under lock and key. The interrogator's curiosity remained piqued, his voice dropping into a softer, almost taunting register. So your work would be repurposed, you say? Into what, exactly? Oh, I can think of a few applications, Devon replied, his voice flat. Take the AI work I've spent years refining, originally designed for medical diagnostics, city planning, helpful things, right? But that same AI could just as easily be deployed for surveillance, for data manipulation, for tracking so-called undesirables. Do you really think I want my life's work used to monitor civilians, to root out dissent, to give a tyrant an even tighter hold on his people? The interrogator paused, as if weighing Devon's words. And you truly believe your government would stoop to such extremes? Devon chuckled darkly. Believe it? I'd bet my soul on it. Every signal is there. I left because in my mind, staying would mean aiding and abetting. If I remained, I'd be no different than the regime's enforcers. I'd become a cog in a machine I can no longer abide. The interrogator sat back, scrutinizing Devon with a new expression, one that was no longer purely skeptical. Perhaps, just perhaps, a glimmer of understanding, or respect, had begun to creep in. The interrogator's gaze sharpened as he shifted gears, pressing Devon on how exactly he'd come to these conclusions. And tell me, Herr Halberry, he said, his voice now a mix of suspicion and intrigue, how do you know all of this was truly in motion? You speak as if you've seen the blueprints yourself. Devon hesitated, but only briefly. He knew there was little point in withholding the truth at this stage. Let's just say I had friends in particular circles, people I've known since childhood, friends who've ended up in the military, intelligence, and even the Justice Department. These weren't just whispers on the wind. He continued, watching the interrogator's expression for any flicker of understanding. Some of these old friends reached out directly. They wanted me to be aware, to understand what I was walking into if I stayed. A few, the ones in security operations, even hinted at their mission briefs, preparations for upcoming assignments that looked suspiciously like, well, snatch and grabs, civilian personnel extractions. And these weren't criminals or dissidents, mind you. They were scientists, engineers, technical experts. Their targets were people who had specialized knowledge that could be useful to the regime. The interrogator's eyebrow quirked, but he remained silent, so Devon pressed on. Others were given unusual training assignments, training in crowd control, tactical operations within civilian areas. These aren't missions for foreign combat. They're designed for use within our own borders. It's all there in black and white. Preparation for civil unrest, or worse, for silencing dissent before it even has a chance to spread. The interrogator folded his arms, still looking unconvinced, and Devon took a breath, continuing. And it wasn't just the military contacts. One friend of mine, from the Justice Department's legal team, confided in me about recent briefs they'd been discussing. Apparently, there's a push to leverage the National Secrets and Technologies Act in some unprecedented ways. They want to use it to suppress the movement of anyone with critical knowledge, designers of weapons systems, tech innovators, researchers with expertise in rapidly advancing fields like AI and biomedicine. The act is now being interpreted as a tool not only to keep information secure, but to keep individuals under control. The interrogator's eyes narrowed, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his icy facade. So, in your view, Herr Halberry, it was simply a matter of time before this net would close around you. Exactly, Devon replied. I didn't need a map to see where this was headed. They'd eventually classify me, and anyone like me, as a national asset, a possession that could be monitored, contained, and, if necessary, forced into compliance. I've been given a lifetime of reasons to fight for my country, but being reduced to a pawn in this regime, forced to feed my work into a machine that would only use it to reinforce control, to suppress voices like my own? No. I refuse to help them build that nightmare. He let his words settle in the air, watching the faint reaction in the interrogator's expression, a mix of cold professionalism and something approaching reluctant respect. The interrogator leaned back with a faint, almost smug smile, letting Devon's last words hang in the air for a long, silent moment. Then, with a carefully measured casualness, he spoke. Herr Halberry, your story paints a compelling picture, I'll grant you that. But how would you feel if I told you that things are somewhat further along than you seem to realize? He paused, reaching into a thick folder on the table, from which he pulled a set of glossy, high-resolution images. One by one, he laid them out in front of Devon with a calm precision, each one more unsettling than the last. Devon blinked, momentarily thrown as he leaned in to examine the photographs. There was a grainy satellite image of a black SUV idling near his house, unmistakably lurking as if waiting for him to leave. Another shot showed the same vehicle shadowing his car from a discreet distance. Devon's pulse quickened when he saw the third image, the blackened crater near an intersection he'd passed that night, a chilling reminder of the construction sounds he'd assumed had just been late-night roadwork. Are you telling me? The interrogator chuckled, an unsettling sound devoid of warmth. 2 attempts, Herr Halberry. 2 failed attempts. The first team was meant to capture you outside your residence, but they encountered some complications. He gestured at the image of the black SUV. Their task was simple. Follow, observe, wait for an opportune moment to escort you for a little chat. Your leaving the country wasn't exactly in their plans, but somehow you slipped through their grasp. He tapped the image of the crater with a casual fingertip. Then there was the second team, more aggressive. Their orders were less focused on conversation, but as you can see, things went poorly for them. An unexpected incident occurred as they were closing in. You assumed that explosion was construction noise, I'm sure. Convenient, don't you think? Devon's stomach twisted. The interrogator continued, eyes glinting with a dark amusement. Of course, the NGRIB intercepted these attempts and ensured they didn't succeed, though I'm sure you're aware that we wouldn't intervene without good reason. It was a considerable effort to secure your departure, Herr Halberry. And yet, here you sit, lamenting the state of your homeland as though you're the only one aware of what's happening. Devon's hands rested on the table, tense, his mind racing. I had no idea. I knew things were bad, but this... Oh, yes, the interrogator interrupted smoothly, almost relishing the moment. It's worse than you think. You were closer to being classified as expendable than you seem to realize. Your government considers you both valuable and disposable, Herr Halberry, and your departure was not appreciated. He leaned in, his voice lowering. Consider that. The next time you tell yourself this was all in your head, you were never safe, and you're still not. That, I imagine, will be quite the adjustment. The interrogator's tone shifted again, taking on a cold, matter-of-fact edge that sent a shiver down Devon's spine. He leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled in front of him as he spoke with a clinical detachment. Consider the amount already spent on you, he said, the words deliberate and heavy. The extensive plastic surgery, the new face, the new identity, all of it. You'll be starting your new job soon, working for us. We certainly hope you'll bring the same enthusiasm to your work here as you did in your previous life. He paused, allowing the implications to settle in the air. But make no mistake, Herr Halberry, you're indebted to us. He let out a short, humorless laugh before continuing. We are, of course, being rather crass about this, but we believe you're both smart enough to understand the full weight of what's been done for you, and perhaps just as importantly, dumb enough to need it spelled out. The interrogator slid a thick folder toward Devon with a faint tap, the weight of it unmistakable. The truth is, you've cost us far more than you realize. Far more than anyone would be willing to pay to merely interrogate you. You're not just a political refugee here, you are a product. And the price tag attached to that product is steep, very steep. Devon's mouth went dry, and the interrogator's gaze never wavered, calculating, watching for any flicker of understanding, any response. The new life you've been handed, the interrogator went on, voice softening just a touch but remaining unyielding, is a gift that came at great expense, and we expect repayment in more ways than one. Your freedom, your future, your safety, none of that is guaranteed anymore. You will contribute, or else... He let the sentence trail off meaningfully. Devon was silent, his mind racing. The walls of his world were closing in fast, and the full weight of the situation was becoming clear. They had given him a new identity, a new chance to live, but in return, he was now bound to them, not just by his actions, but by their investments in him. The interrogator watched him closely, satisfied with the effect of his words, and leaned back again, letting the silence drag on for just a moment too long. We don't make threats, Herr Halberry, he said with a smirk, but we certainly hope you've got a sense of gratitude, because you've already been paid for in full, and we expect nothing less than your cooperation from now on. The interrogator remained silent for a long moment, watching Devon with a sharp, almost predatory gaze. The room felt heavier, the air charged with the quiet tension of a man who knew he had the upper hand and wasn't afraid to wield it. He finally broke the silence, his tone low and calculated. Let's be clear, Herr Halberry, he began, leaning forward slightly. You have value, a great deal of value. That's why we went to such lengths to secure you. Your knowledge, your expertise. It's not something we can simply replace, not something we can afford to lose. But understand this. Today's interrogation has revealed more than just your political leanings or your allegiances. It's revealed your value in a much more practical sense. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing, his voice smooth and condescending. We wanted to make it crystal clear to you that we understand your worth far more than you do. It's quite remarkable, actually, how smart you are, how capable. You see the writing on the wall, you recognize the shifting winds of power. But he leaned in just a fraction, voice dropping. You're not nearly intelligent enough to understand how far things have already gone, how deep the rot really runs. You've been watching the storm clouds, but you failed to notice that the hurricane's already here. It's already tearing apart everything you thought was safe, everything you believed in. Devon's jaw tightened, but the interrogator didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, he pressed on, his tone growing colder. You've lived in this bubble of idealism, haven't you? Thinking that if you just kept your head down long enough, maybe you could outrun the worst of it. But the truth is, you're already a part of it. Whether you like it or not, you've been under surveillance, monitored, carefully calculated. You think you've been making decisions in isolation, but in reality, every move you've made, everything, has been anticipated. The interrogator let out a small, knowing chuckle. You thought you were the one playing the game, didn't you? Running, hiding, getting away. But the game's already over for you, Halberry. The moment you left your country, you became a resource, a commodity. And now that you've come here, now that we've spent what we have to secure you, it's time to face the facts. You're not a free agent anymore. He leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Devon's face. We are offering you the chance to stay alive, to keep that precious mind of yours intact. And in return, we expect you to see things clearly for once. You're not in control here. You never were. And you may want to think long and hard about whether you're willing to throw away everything, your family, your future, your safety, for the sake of some naive notion of resistance. Devon didn't speak, his mind swirling with the weight of the interrogator's words. The cold truth was beginning to settle in. He had underestimated just how far his enemies had gone, how much they already knew, how deep their influence reached. The interrogator's voice softened, almost as if he were offering a bit of guidance. You're smart, Halberry. You're just not wise enough. But you can be. You can understand your place in this. And if you do, we'll make sure you live to see the fruits of your labor. If you don't, well, then you'll be left to watch as your own country's collapse drags you down with it. Devon's mind raced. There was no escape, no easy answer. The interrogator was right about one thing. He was caught in a trap far bigger than he had realized, and it was closing in around him faster than he could adapt. The weight of his situation pressed down on him, and the realization settled like a stone in his chest. You've made your point, Devon finally said, his voice quieter than before, but still tinged with defiance. But don't mistake this for surrender. The interrogator simply smiled, an unreadable expression. I'm not asking for your surrender, Halberry. Not yet. I'm just making sure you understand the game, and whether you choose to play or get played. The interrogator's fingers brushed the side of his head, a subtle movement that Devon only noticed when the earpiece popped free from his ear with a soft click. Devon had been so caught up in the verbal sparring that he hadn't even realized it had been there, concealed in plain sight, a reminder of how deeply involved his every interaction had been with unseen forces. The interrogator set it on the table with an almost casual flick of the wrist before turning back to Devon, his demeanor suddenly less tense and more conversational. In the blink of an eye, the atmosphere shifted. A slight rustling noise came from the shadows near the door as another aide, this one unseated, standing without ceremony, entered, carrying a small tray laden with food and drink. The aroma of the food cut through the sterile scent of the room, rich and comforting, a stark contrast to the sterile tension that had held them captive until now. Well, the interrogator said, rising smoothly from his seat. It seems the time has come for a bit of human decency. A meal, perhaps? He gestured toward the tray, which he guided toward, the table with a practiced ease. I don't expect you to eat for the sake of it, but you'll need the energy for the journey ahead. You've been through quite the ordeal, after all. Devon blinked, not quite sure if he was hearing right. A meal? After everything? Still, he didn't respond immediately, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. The interrogator, as if noticing the confusion, raised an eyebrow and smiled faintly. "You'll be leaving soon," he said, pouring a drink from a bottle into a glass and handing it across to Devon. "It's a long ride, I'm afraid. You'll be blindfolded, of course, just as you were brought here. I regret the need for all the security theater, but you'll understand it when you see where we're going." His tone was almost sympathetic, as though apologizing for the necessity of it all. Devon stared at the drink for a moment, still unsure of how to respond. This was not how he'd envisioned his departure. Then again, when had anything gone according to plan? But the interrogator's calmness was unnerving, as though this entire situation was simply a matter of course. Nothing was real, and yet everything had a purpose. "I suppose it's only fair to introduce myself properly," the interrogator continued, his voice almost warm now. "I'm Constantine. You'll remember that name, I hope, when we're more settled. We'll have plenty of time to talk." He gave a small, knowing chuckle. "Not that I expect you to get too comfortable, but I think we can share a moment, don't you? Perhaps we can even bond over the fact that, well, sometimes what had to be done, had to be done." The words landed heavily in the room, like a weight being dropped onto the table. It was a peculiar sentiment to share after everything, but there was something oddly human in it. Something that acknowledged the brutality of the situation without pretending to soften it. Constantine gestured at the food again, as if trying to break the remaining tension with the mundane. A piece of bread here, a bit of cheese there, a glass of water for balance. "Eat, drink," Constantine said simply, as though offering nothing more than an inconvenient truth disguised as an act of kindness. "We've both been through a great deal today, and as much as we may be on opposite sides of this, there's no harm in a little civility before the road ahead." Devon looked at the meal before him, the food still steaming lightly, and then at Constantine, who was already helping himself to a slice of bread and a sip of his drink. The irony wasn't lost on him. He wasn't sure if he was more stunned by the offer or by how strange it felt. This moment of normalcy amidst everything else. "Fine," Devon said at last, still trying to process the turn of events. He picked up a piece of bread, torn from the roll, and studied it for a second. "I suppose we can share a meal. In the same way, I suppose you've shared everything else with me so far." Constantine smiled again, that same knowing smile, but there was something almost warm behind it now, perhaps even a hint of respect. "Exactly," he said, taking a bite of his own food. "You catch on quickly. I think you'll fit in just fine here." And for a long moment they both ate in silence. The quiet stretch of time between them a strange respite from the intensity of everything that had led up to this. The interrogator and his captive, sharing a meal in the most unusual of circumstances, both knowing full well that what had come before was nothing compared to what lay ahead. When they finished, Constantine stood again, motioning for Devon to do the same. "Time to move. I trust you're ready." Devon nodded, setting down his glass. The blindfold was the next step, and he was ready for it, if only to move on to whatever came next in this twisted new life. But something lingered, a gnawing realization that the distance between what he thought was possible and what was real had grown insurmountably wide. As Constantine guided him out of the room, Devon couldn't help but think that this meal might have been the last bit of kindness he would see for a long time. And in that strange, fleeting moment, he almost wished he could have tasted it for longer. "Constantine." Constantine watched as Devon, the man he had spent the past few hours breaking down, was escorted out of the room. A strange blend of pity and admiration swirled in his mind as he considered Devon's role in the greater machinery of their nation's ambitions. Devon was no ordinary asset. He was a linchpin in the rapidly accelerating world of artificial intelligence research, the kind of mind that didn't come along often, and one that, in these times, was considered too valuable to be left to his own devices. The N-Grib had monitored him for quite some time, catching the first glimmers of his dissatisfaction, watching as the cracks in his loyalty grew. When the opportunity for recruitment came, Konstantin's superiors hadn't hesitated. After all, they were part of a global arms race that didn't involve just weapons of war anymore. It was about intelligence, prediction, and control. Artificial intelligence was the battlefield of the new era, and every piece of the puzzle counted. Konstantin thought about the staggering infrastructure that lay behind their efforts. The nuclear power plants dedicated solely to fueling these predictive engines, the servers running non-stop, training models on data culled from an endless flow of surveillance. Every phone call, every satellite image, every scrap of data passed through these vast systems, feeding hungry algorithms with the lifeblood of information. It was almost frightening, the reach of it all, the sheer power they wielded. And yet, with that power came a strange, paradoxical vulnerability. In a sense, Devon was both a pawn and a player. Konstantin could see it now. The AI models predicting Devon's movements, his allegiances, his risk of defection. Yet for every prediction model that suggested Devon might be a flight risk, another flagged him as a loyalist, unlikely to act against his nation. It was the strange, maddening nature of the predictive engines themselves. They were brilliant, yes, but flawed. For every data point, there was noise. For every signal, there was a distraction. And in a world of vast, competing models, the hardest task for intelligence directors was deciding which predictions to trust and which to discard. It had taken years for Konstantin's own team to refine the process, to learn how to separate what was factual from what was pure hallucination. Fantasies spun up by machines trained on imperfect data, machines that sometimes imagined threats where there were none or missed ones in plain sight. AI models were powerful, yes, but they were far from infallible. Their errors like little landmines of misinformation, lurking in the reports that crossed Konstantin's desk each morning. As he considered all of this, Konstantin felt a flicker of sympathy for Devon. The man probably hadn't realized that his every decision, every restless thought, had been monitored, scrutinized, weighed against projections from engines far beyond his comprehension. Devon had been seen as a defector by one model and an asset by another, his own freedom quietly slipping away beneath layers of algorithmic judgment. But the pity was fleeting. This was, after all, the price of progress, and Konstantin had seen too many men swallowed up by the machine to lose any sleep over one more. Besides, Devon was not merely a victim, he was a contributor to this web of predictive technology, a man whose own work had advanced the very systems that now ensnared him. In a dark way, Konstantin thought, it was almost poetic. Devon's life was now the ultimate test case for the world he had helped create, a world where intelligence was absolute and secrets had a price. With a sigh, Konstantin turned back to the empty room, the tray still sitting on the table, remnants of the food they'd shared just moments before. Devon would be settling into his new life soon enough, kept under watch, as always, by the same predictive engines he had unknowingly served for years. Konstantin gave one last glance toward the door, his face unreadable as he murmured to himself, "The machines have spoken, Devon, and I'm afraid they had the final say." The N-Grib had been meticulous in preparing Devon's escape and reinvention. Years ago, when Devon was still just a promising researcher with dreams untainted by politics, they'd taken blood samples under the guise of routine health screenings. Now, those same samples had been repurposed to fabricate DNA evidence at a staged crash site, a calculated wreck just outside a puppet conflict zone in the Baltic, where alliances were murky and chaos was the norm. The Americans, ever vigilant for defectors and turncoats, would comb through the debris and find exactly what they expected. Traces of Devon Halberry, the traitor whose promising career had ended in a moment of reckless escape. In truth, Devon Halberry was as dead as the bloodied DNA planted in the crash wreckage. Rising from his ashes was Mr. Sackerman Valde, a new man with a well-documented background carefully crafted to blend seamlessly into his new home. Valde was now a person of interest, but not one who would ruffle any feathers. He had a manufactured history, complete with verifiable records, bland enough to draw no scrutiny, yet substantial enough to hold up under examination. His past, they ensured, was as unremarkable as his future would be consequential. But the NGRIB knew well that reinvention went deeper than a name and a set of credentials. They understood the toll such an identity shift could take on even the steadiest mind. The strain of shedding one's former self, the flickering memories of a different life, the instinctual habits tied to a name now dead, all these could chip away at the veneer of any newly assumed role. In anticipation of this, they had embedded Valde in a carefully controlled environment, a place where every interaction could be monitored and every slip could be caught before it unraveled his facade. A place where subtle cues could alert them to any signs of psychological fatigue, any indication that the pressure of his transformation was pushing him back toward the ghost of Devon Halberry. If cracks did form, they would be detected early, handled decisively. They would gently remind him of his new allegiances, his new purpose, and, if necessary, administer just enough psychological reinforcement to keep his loyalty intact. It was a delicate art, this surveillance with a human touch. Just enough to keep him secure in his new skin, but not so much that he felt the bars of his cage. Valde would adjust. He had to. The investment in him was too great to allow him to waver, and besides, the engines that had once predicted his loyalty had also projected his adaptability. In time, he would forget the tastes and instincts of his past self. He would forget the small comforts of being Devon Halberry, just another cog in the American machine, and become entirely Valde, a man whose work was too valuable to allow for nostalgia. And if he faltered, well, the NGRIB had contingencies for that too. Constantine and his superiors had been blindsided by the true extent of American advancements in quantum AGI research. They'd known, of course, that the Americans were heavily invested, but the revelations Devon brought in were beyond anything they had imagined. The core of the Americans' primary sample, an AI seed, as Devon referred to it, was staggeringly advanced, mobile, efficient, and, most critically, able to operate without the sprawling cooling infrastructure traditionally required for quantum systems. This core module was even engineered with a form of interoperability that allowed it to be removed, transported, and reintegrated into other systems without loss or degradation, an achievement that had stunned their team. At the Mensch Machine Labor, known unofficially as the Grüne Machine by those who worked within its well-guarded walls, Constantine's colleagues had struggled to verify the specifics Devon provided. The information was both tantalizing and difficult to confirm with their current technology. It had required hours of intense scrutiny from their top quantum researchers, and even then, suspicions lingered. Constantine had watched with a growing unease as the lab's head researcher, Svantas, pored over the technical readouts, recalculating figures and muttering to himself with a mixture of frustration and awe. In the end, even Svantas, an invaluable and highly regarded figure within the lab, had insisted that he verify the information personally, a decision that added another layer of tension. He hadn't been strictly cleared to work on the material from Devon, but considering they would soon be collaborating on this project anyway, Constantine decided to make an exception. This information was too critical, and Svantas's expertise too vital to get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. The Americans, it seemed, had shattered the boundaries of what the Grüne Machine had believed possible. For years, they had assumed the US lagged slightly behind their own efforts in quantum research, hindered by bureaucratic caution and more rigid protocols. Instead, it now appeared that the Americans had sped past, developing a quantum core so portable, modular, and stable that it might even be field operational within the decade. It was a coup of monumental proportions. For the Grüne Machine team, the implications were exhilarating and terrifying. If Devon's data held true, the American AGI could bypass known limitations, revolutionizing espionage, cybersecurity, even direct battlefield applications. With such compact and stable quantum AI units, they could deploy intelligence assets with unprecedented flexibility, slipping past traditional defenses almost undetectably. Yet Konstantin knew that this leap, impressive as it was, would come with challenges. Integrating Devon's information into their own research would require all their resources and focus. And if they succeeded, the Grüne Machine might still claw its way back to the forefront of the quantum arms race. But for now, Konstantin and his superiors faced an uncomfortable reality. The Americans had set a pace that they would struggle to match, let alone exceed. Konstantin allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. This would not be Mr. Valdez's last stop of the day. In its boundless foresight, the new Germanian Republic had determined that Devon's skills would be of most use in a setting as secure and distant as possible. And so, Devon Halberry, now Mr. Sackerman Valde, would soon find himself bound not just for new quarters, but for the most fortified research complex ever constructed. Gottes Adern, or God's Veins, a sprawling, state-of-the-art facility in lunar orbit. The station was a marvel, a testament to the Republic's dedication to securing its most valuable projects, well beyond the grasp of earthly espionage. Officially, it was a part of their extensive lunar construction efforts, an isolated sanctuary for the Republic's most sensitive work, where only the elite of each field were granted access. Devon, however, wouldn't be sent directly into orbit. First, he would endure another round of screenings, a thorough biological assessment, and an extensive physical preparation regimen to ensure he could withstand the launch and life in space. The NGRIB had arranged for him to spend the next few weeks in grueling physical training to rebuild strength and endurance after the toll of his recent surgeries. He would run, lift, stretch, and acclimate himself to a regimen specifically tailored to the unique demands of space travel. Konstantin pictured Devon's reaction once he learned of his ultimate destination. What thoughts might cross his mind as he realized just how far he was about to be taken from everything familiar, both geographically and ideologically. The Republic hadn't simply recruited him, it was sending him past the very boundaries of Earth itself to the most remote and unreachable lab imaginable. Here, the Republic's quantum AI research would continue, shielded by both technology and distance from any potential interference. Konstantin's smile widened as he considered the careful foresight in all this. Not only was Devon's defection an advantage for the Republic, but his relocation to Gottes Adern would remove any possibility of his return to his homeland. By the time his work at Gottes Adern concluded, Devon, or rather Mr. Valde, might well find himself with no ties to the world he once knew. In the Republic's eyes, he was both a resource and a risk, and sending him to the Lunar Research Station was their way of ensuring he remained one and not the other. As Konstantin reviewed his final notes on Devon Halberry, now Sackerman Valde, he heard the familiar footsteps of his superior approaching. Colonel Heisen, a man with an uncompromising presence and sharp, calculating gaze, entered the room with his typical air of quiet authority. His eyes went directly to Konstantin, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he observed the earpiece Konstantin had removed during the friendly phase of the interrogation. "Still hung up on the earpiece, Konstantin?" Heisen asked, dropping his folder on the table and crossing his arms. "Sentimentality, I thought, was for the recruits. I'll assume you have a sound reason." Constantine allowed himself a small, dry smile, slipping the earpiece back into his pocket. Sentimentality, perhaps, but also pragmatism, Colonel. Letting him see the earpiece removed allowed him to think he'd won a small victory. A shift from pure surveillance to something more human. It may even help him feel like he was heard, like we're treating him with some respect. Hyzen chuckled, an almost grudging acknowledgement. Respect? Well, that will be a new experience for him here. He leaned in, his gaze sharpening. Now tell me, what did you think of his emotional state? Did we end up with a firebrand or something? Moldable? Constantine leaned back, considering. He's complicated. Not the ideologue I'd expected. He's fractured, yes. Politically disillusioned and morally wounded. I'd say he has a heart for rebellion, but not the stomach for it. Too much intellect, too little grounding. Constantine paused as if tasting the words. He's certain of his own rightness, but not certain enough to stand against us. If anything, he's running from something more than toward us. That makes him unstable, but workable. Instability, Hyzen murmured, tapping his fingers on the table. You think it could affect his work? Constantine shrugged. He's still raw from his transition, but given the right surroundings, the right influence, he could become the asset we need. He has a distaste for authority, yes, but mostly for the one he left behind. Here, if we play our cards right, he could come to see his work as meaningful, free from whatever he calls tyranny back home. Hyzen raised an eyebrow. So you believe he'll settle in? He will. Eventually, Constantine said with a faint smile. Devon's a man who's always been devoted to his craft, more so than to any state or ideology. We need to emphasize that angle. Feed his intellectual pride, his sense of innovation. As long as he feels he's doing something grand and important, he'll stay the course. There are, however, some quirks we'll need to keep an eye on. His quirks? Or his sense of superiority? Hyzen smirked. He seems quite certain he's one of the few who sees the world state, doesn't he? Very much so, Constantine replied with a hint of irony. He's clever, but still has that American arrogance. Believes he's the only one who truly understands the dangers of the political situation. I'd say he feels like he's already sacrificed more than most. He's both shaken and self-assured, which is an interesting blend. But a touch of strategic humility wouldn't hurt him. Perhaps a dose of realism, then, Hyzen suggested. He won't be alone up there after all. Surrounded by others as accomplished as himself, maybe he'll feel less singular, less irreplaceable. Precisely, Constantine agreed, his smile turning a little colder. He'll discover quickly enough that we value him for his brain, not his personal worldview. We're not here to cater to his moral scruples. The colonel leaned back, his gaze contemplative. And do you think he'll perform when the time comes? Constantine nodded, his expression resolute. Yes, for all his intellectual restlessness, I believe he'll adapt. He has ambition, Colonel, and he values his work above all else. He just needs to learn where that work belongs now and how critical he is to it. Once he understands that, he'll fall in line. We've already nudged him toward feeling like we're the ones who understand him. We've positioned ourselves as his allies, if only by default. Hyzen's smile was thin. He's malleable, then. Good. It will make his eventual relocation easier to manage. There was a moment of silence as Hyzen studied Constantine, his tone shifting to a quieter, more reflective note. I assume you've thought about how far ahead the Americans were on their quantum AGI? Constantine hesitated, an unusual expression of frustration flashing across his face. We're at a disadvantage there, he admitted, his tone controlled but edged. The technology he's bringing us, we're years behind. They've achieved things we thought improbable, if not impossible. It took even Svantas several hours just to verify the basics of Devon's data. It's going to take us time, significant time, to understand and implement it. Heisen nodded, eyes darkening with thought. But he will help us catch up. We have every resource, every incentive he needs. And if he requires a reminder of what he owes us, well, Heisen's voice dropped with a faint smile. He'll get one. Konstantin gave a faint nod. Understood. Good, Heisen said, standing up to leave. I'll see to it that the rest of his transition goes smoothly. Goddess Adern is nearly complete. Our final clearance is in order. By the time Mr. Valda's training is finished, we'll be ready for his arrival. Now keep him in line, Konstantin. He may be valuable, but he's still expendable. Never let him forget that. With that, Colonel Heisen turned and strode out, leaving Konstantin alone with his thoughts and a faint, sardonic smile. As Colonel Heisen strode away from his conversation with Konstantin, he mulled over the peculiar mix of ambition, risk, and unforeseen opportunity that Devon Halberry's defection had brought to the Republic. The decision to secure a defector of Devon's caliber had not been made lightly. Devon represented the best of what America's military-industrial complex had achieved in artificial intelligence, and even better, a deepening rift between scientist and state. That rift had allowed Devon to come into their fold, but with it came risks and complexities Heisen had been managing with meticulous precision. Devon's arrival came at a critical time for the Republic, particularly as Chancellor Mayer had recently accelerated a mandate to move the Republic's core AI research teams entirely off-planet. The decision had caused tremors through every echelon of the intelligence, scientific, and military branches. In Chancellor Mayer's view, relocating to the lunar orbit complex wasn't just a security measure, but a statement. Goddess Adern, God's veins, would house the Republic's scientific elite and hopefully provide an insurmountable wall against espionage. While it was a staggering display of political will and technical prowess, the logistical nightmare of its construction had led to tight resources, heightened tensions, and considerable hurdles. Yet, Heisen believed the outcome would be a crowning achievement for the Republic, marking a new phase in their dominance over space. The decision to invest so heavily in space, especially in asteroid mining and the development of a space-based industrial backbone, had been strategic and, in some respects, fortuitous. The NGR had deployed an unprecedented number of autonomous asteroid capture craft, returning objects from the asteroid belt at a frequency that had left rival nations scrambling to keep up. The infrastructure around the Goddess Adern facility had quickly become the single most substantial industrial operation in orbit, eclipsing any civilian or government project. Through this, the Republic had also gained an invaluable resource pipeline. Vast quantities of iron, nickel, rare earth metals, and even precious metals like gold and platinum had made their way back to lunar and Earth orbit. Heisen smirked, recalling the chaos that had erupted when the Republic hinted it might return a small fraction of its asteroid-mined gold. Even a few whispers of the quantities involved had been enough to unsettle international markets. The NGR hadn't yet flooded the market with resources, but the sheer volume at its disposal could grant it vast economic leverage. A test mission involving a platinum-rich asteroid had already yielded a surprising dividend, one powerful enough that it could theoretically supply nearly half of the world's industrial platinum demand for a decade. The Republic's space mining fleet, as it was referred to, had rapidly become an undeniable show of power, and Goddess Adern was its nerve center. But the covert reality behind all of this strategic expansion was the AI research itself. The core directive for the Goddess Adern facility had always been to house and shield their AI initiatives. The Republic was betting big on quantum AGI, and Devon's work was poised to propel their research into new dimensions. The facility's strict security protocols, coupled with its physical isolation from Earth, would create a setting for Devon and others like him to work without fear of defection or distraction. Hyzon knew that their enemy nations, most especially America, would be years behind before they could even scratch the surface of the secrets housed within Goddess Addern. Yet the Chancellor's decision had also meant that living conditions on the station had to be far better than a typical scientific outpost. Hyzon had overseen plans for artificial gravity simulators, spacious work quarters, and even areas designed for recreation. Scientists could theoretically live out their entire careers there if required. It was, by necessity, a self-contained environment, a space sanctuary from which their most brilliant minds could focus exclusively on their work. Devon's new role as Sachaman Valde would include integration into this environment where they would carefully monitor his psyche, habits, and, above all, his loyalty. His former life was over. In a few weeks, he would be little more than a ghost. The colonel shook his head slightly, marveling at how the entire operation, from orchestrating Devon's staged death to his new identity and final relocation to the lunar facility, had unfolded as planned. The staged crash and mock investigation back in America had sown the seeds they needed, with carefully planted DNA evidence and misdirected clues painting Devon as a casualty of regional instability. It would take his former colleagues months, maybe years, to suspect anything else if they even thought of him at all. By the time anyone connected the dots, if they ever did, he would be fully integrated into the Republic's research apparatus. As Hyzon approached the secure elevator leading back to his office, he considered one last point from the conversation with Constantine: whether Devon was truly aware of how advanced America's AGI program had become. Constantine had been nearly speechless at the technological details Devon had shared. If even half of it were accurate, the Americans were terrifyingly close to a mobile, quantum-powered intelligence that could break the last physical barriers AI researchers had faced for decades. But that was why Devon Halberry was so invaluable. His data would give the Republic the information it needed to close the gap, to realize its own quantum AGI capabilities, and to secure its dominance, not just over America, but over every major power still focused on Earth. Chancellor Mayer's vision was to expand humanity's reach into space, with the Republic at the forefront, and he needed the world's best minds to make that vision a reality. If Devon could deliver, it would mean that in a matter of years, the Republic's AI, and not any earthbound intelligence, would make the critical discoveries driving the future. As he stepped into the elevator, Hyzon allowed himself a grim smile. Devon Halberry, or rather, Sachaman Valde, had no choice now but to cooperate. In time, he would come to understand that the Republic was his only path forward. And if he didn't, Hyzon would make sure he understood the true price of the Republic's hospitality.
Metallic whispers from the void. Stars are dying. Ain't no noise. Solar flares dancing unseen. Vacuums quiet. Hides the scheme. Planets drift like ghostly ships. Dark matter's got the tightest grips. Gravity are too